Welcome to the deep dive. We're really glad you're joining us today.
Yeah, thrilled to have you here.
So, when we hear the word convoy, I feel like our minds often immediately jump to, lines of 18-wheelers on the highway or
World War II supply ships.
right, exactly, those gray ships crossing the Atlantic. But today, our mission is to look at the hidden counterintuitive mathematics and the psychology that actually make those formations work.
Because it's a lot more complex than just driving in a line.
Oh, absolutely. We're unpacking this really comprehensive Wikipedia article on the convoy to discover how grouping vehicles together completely changes your odds of survival.
Whether that's navigating the Atlantic or, civilian cars battling a blizzard on a mountain path.
Right. It's a concept that defies basic human psychology, and it requires this incredibly complex logistical dance.
To set the stage for you here, we want to establish from the get-go that this deep dive goes way beyond military history. We're really looking at the geometry of risk. It's about the psychology of leadership and that fundamental human drive to find safety in numbers when the odds are just overwhelming.
The visual backdrop for today, if you can picture it, it's this blend of antique, faded maritime charts overlapping with highly illuminated modern highway maps.
Because the underlying principles transcend both time and terrain.
Okay, let's unpack this by going way back.
Let's do it.
The idea of naval convoys, which is, merchant ships traveling under naval protection, it actually dates all the way back to the 12th century.
That's incredible.
Right. And by the late 18th century, during the French Revolutionary Wars, navies had developed these highly effective convoy tactics to ward off pirates and privateers. We're talking massive groups, sometimes several hundred merchant ships sailing together.
The Spanish treasure fleets did this constantly, right? From the 1520s all the way to 1790.
Exactly. But looking at the mechanics of it, there is this massive paradox right at the center of the strategy.
And that paradox is really the foundation of the whole concept. It's entirely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
The core mechanism of a convoy is that grouping a massive amount of ships together actually makes them harder for an enemy to find.
Harder, not easier.
Right. Consider the sheer vastness of the ocean during the Age of Sail. If you have merchant ships sailing independently, just scattered all over the shipping lanes,
A privateer can just cruise those lanes and pick them off.
intercept them one by one as they pass through. Exactly. But if you take 100 ships and put them in a single tight convoy, mathematically, that convoy is essentially just as hard to locate in the open ocean as a single isolated ship.
It's a needle in a haystack.
And bundling all the needles together doesn't make the bundle much more visible than the single needle?
Because the ocean provides this ultimate camouflage through its sheer scale.
Yes.
And even if a privateer gets incredibly lucky, right?
Yeah.
They stumble upon this massive convoy, the wind is perfectly in their favor.
Which is rare.
Very rare. They still run into a severe logistical bottleneck. They can really only hope to board and capture a tiny handful of ships before the rest of the fleet just scatters into the horizon.
Plus, the convoy usually has a small escort of dedicated warships.
Right, they can just thwart the attack while the merchants escape.
The historical data proves how effective this was, too. The economic markets themselves recognize the mathematical safety of the group.
The insurance premiums.
Yes, wartime insurance premiums were consistently, demonstrably lower for ships that sailed in convoys. The underwriters understood the geometry of the sea better than anyone.
Follow the money.
Always. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Royal Navy had such a sophisticated system in place, and the financial losses of unescorted ships were so devastatingly high that no merchant ship was legally allowed to sail without an escort.
Wow. But, the evolution of technology always forces a change in tactics.
Right.
As we move into the early 20th century, World War I, the dreadnought battleship enters the global stage. And suddenly, these navies that relied on convoys for centuries are absolutely terrified to group their ships together.
Because the dreadnought completely disrupted that existing balance of naval power.
Yeah.
These capital ships were much faster than standard merchant vessels, and they could fire massive, armor-piercing shells from incredibly long ranges.
So the fear was that a single enemy dreadnought could just sit on the horizon.
Well, out of range of any standard escort,
Right.
and systematically destroy an entire convoy before the slow merchant ships could ever scatter.
Just fish in a barrel.
Exactly! The only way to defend against a capital ship was to escort the convoy with another capital ship.
Which is an impossibly high opportunity cost.
Navies simply refused to tie down their best multi-million-dollar warships just to babysit civilian freighters.
But looking at the historical data from World War I, those massive dreadnoughts weren't doing the actual sinking, were they?
No, they weren't.
The German capital ships were mostly bottled up in the North Sea by the British blockade. The actual devastation came from a technology that acted incredibly like those old 18th century privateers.
The U-boat.
The U-boat.
The submarine was the true menace, and its tactical reality was remarkably constrained. A World War I-era submarine was only slightly faster than the merchant ships it hunted.
Especially when submerged.
Right. Furthermore, they had a very limited supply of torpedoes and deck gun shells. Even if a U-boat found a convoy, it could only sink a small fraction of the vessels before exhausting its munitions or just having to flee.
Yet, despite this reality, the British Admiralty vehemently resisted adopting convoys early in the conflict.
They fought it hard.
The rationale the Admiralty provided for this resistance is fascinating to look back on. They claimed convoys would ruin maritime productivity.
How so?
Because an entire group of ships would be forced to move at the speed of the absolute slowest vessel in the formation.
Ah, right.
They argued ships would waste precious time sitting in port just waiting for this massive convoy to assemble. And finally, they claimed that when this huge group of ships finally arrive at their destination all at once, they would completely overload the port's resources, causing massive delays in unloading.
What's fascinating here is the underlying psychological mechanism at play, which goes far beyond simple logistical concerns.
Yeah.
Dr. Norman Dixon explores this deeply in his book on the psychology of military incompetence. He suggests that the naval establishment's hostility toward convoys was driven by a subconscious perception that convoy duty was, in his words, effeminating.
Effeminating. So the argument is that the act of caring for civilians was seen as lesser work for a warship.
Precisely that. The idea of warships having to shepherd and protect and care for civilian merchant vessels, it just didn't fit the glamorous, aggressive, highly masculine ideal of hunting down the enemy fleet in a glorious, decisive battle.
Right, the big battleship duel.
Convoy duty meant exposing your crew and your warships to the brutal, freezing, hazardous conditions of the North Atlantic for weeks on end, often with very little visible achievement to show for it.
Just enduring freezing spray while fending off an unseen submarine doesn't offer the same glory.
Not at all.
But the actual data, once they compiled and analyzed it, completely dismantled the Admiralty's logistical excuses.
Of course it did.
When they finally looked at the shipping losses, ships and convoys were far less likely to be sunk, even when they didn't have a dedicated escort. Simply due to that geometry of the ocean we discussed earlier?
The needle in the haystack.
Exactly. And the productivity lost to ships waiting in port. It was negligible compared to the total productivity lost when independent ships and their cargo were just sitting at the bottom of the ocean.
That makes perfect sense.
And the ports actually handled convoys more efficiently.
Yeah.
The ships arrived on a predictable, centralized schedule, allowing the dockmasters to plan their labor in advance.
It's a textbook example of institutional ego-blinding leadership to statistical reality. They finally officially introduced transatlantic convoys in September 1917.
Saving Britain from starvation.
Yes, but it took an agonizingly long time and a staggering loss of life to get there.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because that brings us to World War II, which is arguably the ultimate cat-and-mouse game in the history of naval warfare.
Absolutely.
The moment World War II was declared, the British learned from their previous mistakes. They didn't hesitate. They adopted a convoy system immediately. Initially voluntary, but it quickly became compulsory.
Huge groups. Right.
Massive.
Yeah.
30 to 70 mostly unarmed merchant ships moving together, loaded with vital supplies from Canada and later the U.S., desperately trying to keep Britain supplied and in the war.
The sheer drama and the brutal struggle of these Atlantic crossings cannot be overstated. It was an environment of constantly escalating tactics. Survival often hinged on split-second decisions and incredible sacrifice.
A perfect example of that sacrifice is the story of Convoy HX-84 in November 1940. The convoy is making its crossing when it encounters the German heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer.
A very dangerous ship.
Extremely. Several merchant ships are quickly targeted and sunk, but the convoy escapes complete annihilation because of what happens next. An armed merchant cruiser named HMS Jervis Bay, along with a freighter named Beaverford, break formation.
And an armed merchant cruiser was literally just a civilian passenger ship with some outdated guns bolted to the deck.
Right. But they turn and engage the heavy cruiser. They essentially throw themselves in a vastly superior, heavily armored warship to buy the rest of the convoy precious time to scatter into the failing evening light.
Wow.
They knowingly sacrifice themselves to ensure the survival of the larger group.
And conversely, we see the immense deterrent value of a properly armed escort with convoy HX-106.
Tell us about that one.
In early 1941, that convoy, made up of 41 merchant ships, was spotted by two fearsome German capital ships, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau.
Big one.
Heavily armed, incredibly fast, but the British had attached HMS Ramillies as the convoy's escort. Now, Ramillies was a slow, old battleship from a previous era,
Okay.
but she possessed massive 15-inch guns. When the German commanders saw her silhouette, they literally fled the scene.
They ran.
They simply refused to risk taking even a single hit from those massive 15-inch shells, and the convoy sailed on, completely untouched.
That's amazing. But despite these clear demonstrations of the convoy's effectiveness, humanity's stubbornness strikes again.
As it always does.
After Germany declares war on the United States, the U.S. Navy is tasked with securing the American eastern seaboard. The British, drawing on years of hard-won experience, are practically begging the Americans to implement coastal convoys.
But U.S. Fleet Admiral Ernest King ignores the advice.
Reportedly because he had formed a very poor opinion of the Royal Navy earlier in his career and just refused to adopt their tactics.
The outcome of that administrative decision was historically devastating. And focusing purely on the historical outcome here, U-boat crews operating off the American coast found so many unescorted, easily targeted ships silhouetted against the bright lights of American coastal cities.
It didn't even turn off the city lights.
No. The U-boat crews actually referred to this period as their second happy time.
Ooh.
It was an absolute slaughter of merchant shipping, millions of tons of cargo, thousands of lives lost. It only ended when the United States finally yielded to reality and implemented a comprehensive coastal convoy system.
Once the Allied forces were uniformly aligned on the strategy, it kicked off this staggering technological race between the Allies and the Germans.
The cat and mouse game.
Right. The Germans realized single U-boats couldn't easily defeat convoys, so they developed wolf packs. Strings of U-boats spread across the ocean, directed by radio, to swarm a convoy simultaneously once it was spotted.
They deployed long-range surveillance aircraft to shadow the ships. They cracked British naval codes to intercept routing information.
And they developed terrifying new weapons. Magnetic detonators that exploded beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back. Sonic homing torpedoes that locked onto the sound of a ship's propellers.
The Allied response required equal ingenuity and massive industrial mobilization.
They had to step up.
They began converting merchant ship hulls into small escort carriers to provide vital air cover in the mid-Atlantic gap, where land-based planes just couldn't reach.
And they deployed Q ships, which is such a fascinating concept.
Oh, Q ships are wild.
These were heavily armed submarine hunters, meticulously disguised to look like helpless, unarmed merchant ships.
A trap.
Yes. The goal was to lure a U-boat to the surface, because U-boats preferred to use their deck guns on unarmed ships to save precious torpedoes. And once the submarine surfaced, the Q-ship would drop its false bulkheads and unleash heavy artillery.
Brilliant. The Allies also brought in cheaply produced but highly effective destroyer escorts and frigates to bolster the defensive numbers.
And they invented the Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon. Traditional depth charges were dropped off the back of a ship and exploded at a set depth. But the explosions would violently churn the water and temporarily blind the hunting ship's sonar,
allowing the submarine to slip away in the chaos.
Exactly. The Hedgehog solved this by firing a circular grid of bombs ahead of the ship. These bombs only exploded on physical contact with the submarine. If there was no explosion, the sonar operator knew they missed and could maintain a continuous track on the target.
It completely changed the math of the hunt. They also broke the German Enigma cipher to route convoys around wolf packs and began allocating vessels to specific convoys based on their top speed, so the faster ships wouldn't be held back and exposed longer than necessary.
If we look at the Pacific theater during the same period, there's a stark and tragic contrast in doctrine. Japanese merchant ships rarely traveled in organized convoys early in the war.
The Japanese Navy simply did not invest in developing inexpensive, dedicated convoy escorts like the Allied frigates until it was far too late.
Right. And while early American submarine tactics were pretty timid and plagued by famously faulty torpedoes, Once Admiral Charles A. Lockwood rectified those issues, U.S. submarines systematically decimated the Japanese merchant fleet.
Largely because it was sailing unescorted.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And the Japanese submarine force made a massive strategic error of their own. Unlike the U.S. and German subs that prioritized severing enemy supply lines, Japanese naval doctrine dictated that submarines should focus primarily on trying to sink U.S. battle fleets.
They largely ignored the vulnerable merchant convoys.
Even more critically, they ignored the massive, unwieldy invasion convoys carrying all the troops, fuel, and equipment for the U.S. island-hopping campaign.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it all comes down to the raw mathematics of naval warfare, which we can call the footprint analysis.
The footprint analysis.
A submarine, especially in the 1940s, is incredibly slow when submerged, often moving slower than a person can run. It also has incredibly limited vision. A submarine commander looking through a periscope is essentially looking through a tiny straw at a vast, curving ocean.
Because the horizon is only a few miles away at that height.
Precisely. So no matter how many ships you pack into a single convoy, its collective footprint, the actual physical area within which it can be visually spotted or detected by hydrophones, is astronomically smaller than if all those same ships were scattered independently across hundreds of miles of sea.
A submarine had a mathematically much lower chance of stumbling upon one dense, heavily defended cluster.
Much lower than finding a steady stream of single, undefended targets.
And because the ocean was swept clean of those single targets, if the U-boats actually wanted to fulfill their mission, they had no choice. They had to attack the convoys.
The convoys became irresistible, mandatory targets. But by forcing the submarines to attack the convoy, the Allies completely flipped the dynamic. The U-boats were practically delivering themselves right to the Allied escorts.
Walking right into the trap.
To get a firing solution, a U-boat had to maneuver through screens of heavily armed destroyers and radar-equipped aircraft. They suffered severe losses for very little gain because the system forced them to attack unified, heavily defended groups.
That mathematical reality, that a dense cluster is harder to exploit than scattered individuals, it didn't disappear when the war ended.
No, it just moved onto dry land.
Convoys are deeply embedded in the modern civilian world. In the 1990s, the word convoy became heavily associated with humanitarian aid.
Volunteers were driving road vehicles packed with vital supplies from Western Europe into devastated areas like the former Yugoslavia.
To underfunded Romanian orphanages and into the exclusion zones affected by the Chernobyl disaster.
These humanitarian convoys provided something that massive UN efforts often couldn't manage. They offered a highly visible, tangible show of solidarity from large numbers of small, dedicated groups.
It wasn't just about delivering physical goods, it was about the physical presence of a unified front crossing borders together.
And then there is the classic trucker convoy, which has fascinating origins in domestic policy. It was born out of the United States national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit instituted in the 1970s.
Truckers had brutal, rigid schedules to make a living, and they quickly became the prime targets for highway police speed traps.
So they adapted using the principles of the group. Multiple trucks would group together and run at high speeds. The logic was simple. If a massive convoy of semi-trucks speeds past a single police radar trap, the officer can realistically only pull over one of them.
The rest maintain their schedule. Plus, they save massive amounts of fuel by drafting off the aerodynamic slipstream of the truck in front of them, reducing drag.
It created this whole culture of camaraderie built around the CB radio, famously immortalized in pop culture.
It's a profound form of collective action on the highway, and that action is highly adaptable. Truck convoys are regularly organized for charity runs and fundraising events.
They are also utilized as a powerful form of demonstration. And we need to make it explicitly clear to our listeners here, we are simply reporting on the source material and historical events, not endorsing any political viewpoints. But looking at events like the 2022 Canada convoy protests, it is a prime example of how the sheer physical mass of grouped vehicles can be leveraged as a mechanism for political protest.
It demonstrates that the spatial dominance of a convoy is a tool that can be used for various civic purposes.
The concept goes beyond just informal agreements, too. There are actual codified legal frameworks for this in Europe known as special convoy rights.
Really? Legal frameworks?
Yes. In several European countries like Norway, Italy, Germany, the national highway codes have specific provisions for marked convoys.
Wait.
If a convoy is organized and marked correctly, often utilizing the NATO Standard 2154 standard, which dictates specific flag colors on the lead and trail vehicles, standardized lighting patterns.
Numbered markings, that sort of thing.
Exactly. If it has all that, the entire convoy is legally treated by the traffic laws as a single continuous vehicle.
That is a massive subversion of standard traffic law, just to maintain the integrity of the group.
It is.
Meaning, if the first truck makes it through an intersection while the light is green, every other vehicle in that marked convoy gets to follow them through, even if the light turns red and cross-traffic has a green light.
Nobody is allowed to break the queue.
Wow.
It's heavily used by the military to keep units cohesive, but it's also activated for severe civilian catastrophes.
Like what?
If there is large-scale flooding requiring massive earth-moving equipment, or if a city needs to evacuate a specific sector to defuse an unexploded World War II bomb, emergency services will move their units under these exact convoy rights to ensure they aren't separated by normal traffic signals.
And speaking of extreme civilian situations, we have to look at Norway's storm convoys. The local term is kolonic-juring. In the dead of winter, the winds on the high mountain passes are so fierce they instantly fill the roads with deep snow immediately behind the plows.
Driving it alone is quite literally a death sentence.
So the authorities initiate convoy driving. A strictly limited number of civilian cars are vetted at a checkpoint. If your car isn't fit for the conditions or you don't have winter gear, the convoy leader will turn you away.
And the cars that make the cut are escorted in a tight single-file line directly behind a heavy snowplow plunging through the blizzard.
It's an incredibly intense, high-stakes operation. The conditions are so poor and visibility is so low that these storm convoys are actually prone to multiple vehicle collisions if a driver panics or breaks formation.
Or just loses sight of the taillights in front of them. To give you a sense of the sheer scale of this operation, the Saltfjellet Mountain Pass saw almost 500 hours of strictly convoy driving in the winter of 1990 alone.
Incredible.
And for you listening right now, what stands out to you when you realize that the exact same principles used to dodge U-boats in the icy waters of the Atlantic perfectly map onto a line of civilian hatchbacks trying to survive a whiteout blizzard on a Norwegian mountain?
It's amazing to see the through line there. So what does this all mean? As we wrap up this deep dive, whether you are a merchant dodging privateers in the age of sail, a supply ship evading U-boats, a trucker avoiding traffic cameras, or a commuter surviving an avalanche zone, a convoy is a testament to one simple, enduring fact.
We are safer, we are more efficient, and we are stronger when we move together.
You're sacrificing a little bit of your individual freedom. You have to drive at the speed of the group. You can't just wander off on your own schedule. But in exchange for that freedom, you gain the impenetrable armor of the collective.
And for you, the learner listening today, there is a profound practical takeaway here. You are currently navigating a world of massive information overload.
Oh, definitely.
The modern internet is a vast, chaotic ocean, and misinformation acts very much like a predatory submarine waiting to exploit vulnerabilities. Finding your own convoy, curating a tight, vetted group of trusted sources, or surrounding yourself with a community of rigorous learners can protect you from being picked off by bad data.
Or just overwhelmed by the paralyzing volume of noise. That is a brilliant way to frame how we consume information today.
But this raises an important question, something for you to mull over long after we finish today.
Okay.
The source material made it mathematically clear that the footprint of a massive convoy is actually smaller and harder to find than scattered individual ships. If we apply that exact logic to the digital age, could a data convoy be the future of cybersecurity and privacy?
Oh, wow.
Right now, we scatter our sensitive personal information across dozens of weak individual accounts and passwords all over the web, making ourselves easy targets for hackers to pick off one by one. Could grouping all our personal data together behind a single, heavily fortified digital proxy actually make us safer, shrinking our digital footprint and making us harder to exploit?
That is an incredible, provocative thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of convoys. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for those hidden connections hiding in plain sight, and keep exploring. We will see you next time.